Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're looking at something huge, something that's really changing the face of our planet. Non-native species, or NNS. And when we talk about NNS, the scale is just immense. These invasions are fundamentally altering biodiversity, how ecosystems work, and, well, the price tag is staggering. We're talking documented costs over the last 40 years, heading north of $1 trillion US.
That's right. It's a massive economic hit.
And it's not slowing down. Projections are showing maybe a 36% increase in the number of non-native species in the coming decades.
Beyond the sheer numbers and the cost, there's this fundamental ecological puzzle, isn't there?
Right.
How do we figure out which species, out of millions, actually become successful invaders when they get moved somewhere new? It's a huge challenge.
It really is. And
Right.
that central question is what drives the paper we're diving into today. It's a 2023 study in global ecology and biogeography led by Elizabeth Briski. And the title asks a pretty direct question. Does non-native diversity mirror Earth's biodiversity? So let's frame this for you. Imagine you have a giant jar of marbles, all different colors representing different groups of life. If you just randomly scoop out a handful, you'd expect the colors in your hand to roughly match the proportions in the whole jar, right?
That's the basic idea.
So the question is, are these non-native invaders just a random scoop from the global jar? If, say, 10% of all species belong to group X, should we find that 10% of invaders also come from group X? Or is something else going on? Are certain groups somehow better invaders, or maybe are we picking certain groups more often?
Exactly. And to test that, the researchers started with what we call the null hypothesis. Think of it as the baseline assumption of randomness. It draws from ideas like neutral theory and ecology. If transport and setting up shop were totally random, like every species basically had the same lottery ticket, then the mix of non-native species should just mirror the overall mix of life on Earth. More species in a group globally should mean more invaders from that group proportionally.
Okay, so that's the random benchmark. How did they actually test it against what's happening in the real world?
Well, this is where the heavy lifting came in. They pulled together this enormous database, truly one of the most comprehensive global lists of established non-native species ever. We're talking 36,822 species confirmed as established somewhere outside their native range.
36,000, that's a massive data set.
It really is. It's the biggest global snapshot we've had like this.
Yeah.
And having that allowed them to do the comparison. They looked at the actual observed numbers of NNS in different taxonomic groups and compared that to what you'd expect based purely on how many species exist globally in those groups. They got the global numbers from sources like the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, GBIF.
And they did this comparison at different levels of the biological hierarchy.
Yes, across 3 key levels. Phylum, which is very broad, then class, and down to the family level, which is much more specific.
Okay, so the stage is set. Big database of real invaders, a model of what pure randomness would look like. Did the real world match the random model? Did the proportions hold up?
Well, the short answer, absolutely not. Yeah, the core finding is pretty clear. Non-native diversity is not just a simple proportional slice of global biodiversity. They found really significant differences, deviations from that random null model.
So randomness alone doesn't explain it.
Nope. Rejected at all levels they looked at. Phylum, class, and family. Something else is clearly shaping which species make it.
Okay, that's where it gets really interesting then. What did they find about why it's not random? Did the predictive power of just knowing how big a group is globally change at different levels?
It did, dramatically. And this is key. It tells us something about where raw numbers matter versus where other factors take over. So at the very broadest level, the phylum, knowing how many species are in a phylum globally, did explain a fair amount of why some phyla have more invaders, about 58% of the variation.
Okay, 58% isn't bad, so bigger phyla do tend to produce more invaders.
Generally, yes. At that very broad scale, the sheer size of the species pool still carries significant weight. Makes sense, right? More potential candidates.
But you said it changed. What happened when they looked closer at class and family?
Well, that's where the predictive power really starts to fall off a cliff. When they went down to the class level, global biodiversity only explained about 42% of the variation in NNS numbers.
Okay, quite a drop, down from 58 to 42.
And then, at the family level, the most specific group they analyzed, that number plummeted. Global species richness within a family only explained about 28% of why some families have lots of invaders and others don't.
Wow, only 28%. So if I'm understanding this, knowing how many species a particular family has worldwide tells you less than a third of the story about its invasion success?
Pretty much.
That leaves, what, 72% unexplained just by random chance and group size? That seems huge.
It is huge. And that massive 72% chunk is where all the other factors come roaring in. Things like specific traits that help a species invade, how well it matches the new environment, how many individuals get introduced to its tropical pressure, and crucially, human preferences and actions.
Right. So at the family level, it's much less about just being a big group and much more about having the right stuff or being actively chosen or moved by us.
Exactly. Being big isn't enough. You need something extra, or you need humans to give you a big leg up.
And did they see patterns related to where these invasions happen, like land versus water?
Yes, they did. And this adds another layer. They found that global biodiversity, just the sheer number of species in a group, was actually a better predictor for invasions happening on land in terrestrial systems compared to freshwater or marine systems.
Interesting. Why would that be?
Well, this links directly back to us, to human activity. When you look at which groups are way overrepresented as invaders, meaning they have far more NNS than their global size would predict, what do you find?
Let me guess. The ones we like or use.
Bingo. They are overwhelmingly the groups that humans have intentionally introduced around the world. Think about things like agriculture, aquaculture, the pet trade, ornamental plants, sport fishing, game animals. We move these species deliberately, often in huge numbers and repeatedly. That's massive propagule pressure.
Right, you're basically loading the dice for those specific groups, giving them way more chances to establish than species that just accidentally hitch a ride.
Precisely.
So which groups specifically popped out as being way overrepresented thanks to us?
Well, the phylum Chordata, that us, vertebrates, was top of the list pretty much everywhere. Then, within that, specific classes really stood out. On land, it was consistently aves, birds, reptilia, and mammalia. Think about introduced game birds, escaped pets like reptiles or mammals moved for farming or hunting.
Okay, and in the water.
In freshwater and marine systems, the big one was Actinopteria, the ray-finned fishes. Think trout, carp, tilapia, moved all over the place for fish farming and stocking leagues for anglers.
Makes sense. What about plants or insects?
Oh, yeah. Tracheophyta, the vascular plants, were hugely overrepresented on land. I mean, think about agriculture, forestry, gardening. We move plants intentionally more than almost any other group. And certain insect and arachnid groups also showed up strongly, often linked to those plant movements or other human pathways.
So the story seems pretty clear. The species winning the invasion game right now are largely the ones we picked to win for our own reasons.
That seems to be the dominant pattern, yes. The intentional introductions really skew the picture away from pure random chance based on global diversity.
But what about all the accidental invaders, the stowaways, the little critters that hitchhike on ships or in soil, like maybe some worms or sea squirts?
That's a good question. The paper suggests that even many of those unintentionally moved species are often linked to the pathways created for the intentional ones. Or they're just sort of the collateral damage, the species that happen to survive well on the major transport vectors we use, like global shipping or the soil trade associated with plants.
So even the accidental stuff is kind of filtered through our activities and choices.
To a large extent, yes. Our trade routes, our cargo choices, they structure which accidental invaders get moved and where.
It's a really strong case that human intention is acting like this massive filter, especially overriding the influence of just raw species numbers when you look at finer scales like families. But we should probably talk about the data itself. You mentioned it was huge, but are there any known gaps or biases, particularly land versus water?
Absolutely, that's a critical point. Despite the huge overall number, there's a massive imbalance. The dataset has around 31,000 terrestrial NNS, but only about 3,500 freshwater and 4,200 marine NNS combined.
Whoa, that's a huge difference. Is that because land is just inherently more invaded?
Probably not entirely. It's widely thought to reflect a major study bias. We've just put way more effort into documenting invasions on land compared to aquatic systems, especially the deep ocean. There are likely significant data gaps underwater.
And you can actually see evidence of this gap in how new invaders are being discovered in different environments, right? Something about the rate of finding new families.
Exactly. This is fascinating. They looked at the rate of taxonomic accumulation. Think of it like this. How many new species do you have to find before you encounter one from a family that hasn't invaded before?
Okay.
On land, in terrestrial systems, that curve is starting to flatten out. You need to find about 20 new established NNS before you hit one from a family that's new to the list of invaders.
Suggesting we've probably already seen introductions from most of the terrestrial families that are likely to invade, or at least those easily moved.
That's the interpretation. We might be approaching a kind of taxonomic plateau on land, but compare that to the water.
Okay, what are the numbers there?
In freshwater, you only need to find 6 new NNS, on average, to get one from a new invading family.
Much faster discovery of new families.
And in marine systems, it's even more dramatic. You find a species from a previously unrecorded invading family for roughly every 3 new NNS discovered.
Every third species is from a new family group. That's incredible.
It really is. It screams that the invasion process in aquatic environments, especially marine, is far from reaching the kind of saturation or taxonomic completeness we see hints of on land. The curve is still incredibly steep.
So we're likely massively undercounting the true number and diversity of invaders in the water.
That's the strong implication. We're still finding novel invaders at a very high rate. And then there's another issue compounding this, something called the Smalls rule in invasion ecology, which the paper also notes.
The Smalls rule, what's that?
It's basically the observation that very small organisms, often things less than a millimeter like tiny algae, protists, small worms, crustaceans, tend to get ignored or missed in invasion surveys.
Because they're hard to see or identify.
Exactly. If you're not specifically looking for them with the right methods, you just don't count them. This introduces a potentially huge bias, underestimating invasion rates, especially in aquatic systems where many organisms are tiny.
Okay, so let's try and pull this deep dive together. The paper shows that while global biodiversity, the size of the species pool, definitely plays a role, bigger groups tend to have more invaders overall.
Right. It's a necessary baseline.
It's clearly not the whole story, especially when you zoom in. That randomness model breaks down pretty significantly.
It does.
And the big drivers distorting that random pattern seem to be things like how many individuals get introduced, propagule pressure, how well the environment fits, and maybe most powerfully, our deliberate choices about which species to move around.
That's really the core message, I think. What we see now in terms of established non-native species is this interplay between the available global pool of life and the very heavy thumb humans are putting on the scale through intentional introductions and the transport pathways we've created.
Certain groups get this massive non-random boost.
They absolutely do. It swamps the effect of just pure chance or species richness alone, particularly at those finer taxonomic levels like families.
Which leads us to a final, kind of provocative thought to leave you with, something the paper touches on right at the end. They point out that right now, all the established NNS we've counted, that huge list of 36,000 plus emergeno, still only represents about 1% of all known species on Earth. Just 1%.
A tiny fraction, globally speaking.
And the study showed that as invasion numbers increase, like we see on land compared to the sea, the predictive power of just knowing the global biodiversity increases. The system becomes a bit more predictable based on raw numbers as it gets more saturated with invaders.
Right.
So here's the thought. As globalization continues, as trade routes potentially move more species, and more of that other 99% of biodiversity gets unintentionally or intentionally shuffled around, will the current overwhelming importance of our choices, the intentional introductions, start to fade?
You mean, will it eventually become more random again?
Could it? If basically everything gets a chance to move eventually, does the system reach a point where the sheer statistical weight of global species richness takes over again, simply because the human filter becomes less relevant when all groups have had numerous shots at invading?
That's a fascinating question.
The data kind of hints that this might happen eventually, suggesting there's this enormous, currently unrealized invasion potential out there, waiting for the opportunity to establish, potentially across the entire tree of life, not just our favorite groups.
It's a sobering thought. It implies the invasion debt might be far, far larger than we currently perceive.
Definitely something to keep watching as we continue rearranging life on this planet.